Hi everyone, welcome back to 1% Crime. I know you can't sleep, so tonight I'll tell you a story that haunted Philadelphia for more than 60 years. It is a story of poverty, loss, and mystery. It is the story of a nameless boy found discarded in a cardboard box, a child who lay in an unmarked grave for decades until science finally gave him back his name. The case is remembered as the boy in the box. It was February of 1957, the last weeks of winter in Philadelphia. The air was damp and raw. The kind of cold that seeped into your bones made breath hang in the air like smoke. On the northern edge of the city, the Fox Chase neighborhood lay quiet. It was not yet suburban, not yet built up. Back then, Fox Chase was a patchwork of scrubby woods, meadows, and farmland with a scattering of old houses. Narrow roads wound past thickets of trees and briar. In the evenings, smoke drifted from chimneys, but by nightfall the fields were silent. On February 25th, a young man was walking through the brush along Susquehanna Road. Some say he was checking his muskrat traps. Others say he was simply curious about the area. Either way, his eye caught a cardboard box lying in the weeds. It was large, the kind used to hold a baby bassinet, the brand name still faintly printed on the side. He pried it open, and inside he saw a small body, a boy, wrapped in a thin plaid blanket, naked, bruised, and lifeless. The young man didn't report it immediately. With accounts differ. Some say he feared trouble. Others say he didn't want his traps discovered. For a day, the box lay where it was. It wasn't until another young man, a student driving by, stopped to investigate the brush that the discovery was finally called in. By the time police arrived, the February light was already fading, and the cold air clung to the little valley. What they found inside the box shocked even seasoned officers. The boy looked to be between 3 and 7 years old. He was painfully thin, his ribs visible beneath pale skin. His hair had been crudely cut, as though someone had taken scissors to it in a hurry. Clumps of hair still clung to his body. His small face bore bruises, and his body showed scars, evidence of long-term neglect or abuse. His nails were bitten short. Investigators estimated that he had died only a few days earlier. Detectives moved quickly. They fingerprinted him, photographed him, and searched missing child reports. They thought the case would be solved within hours. Surely some frantic parent would come forward, desperate to claim him. But hours stretched into days, and no one did. No missing child matched his description. No neighbor recognized him. He was a boy without a name. The medical examiner's report revealed more details. The boy had been malnourished. His growth stunted. He had injuries old and new, bruises, scars, and possibly evidence of surgical procedures like circumcision and hernia repair. His stomach was empty. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. More unsettling still, his haircut looked recent, as though done after death, perhaps to disguise him, and there were signs he may have been bathed. Whoever left him in that box had tried to erase him. The cardboard box itself offered few clues. Investigators traced it to a local JCPenney store, where it had been sold as packaging for a baby bassinet. Dozens had been shipped, dozens sold, and no record kept of individual purchases. The plaid blanket was traced to a factory as well, but again it was one of many, sold widely. The trail led nowhere. The police refused to give up. They dressed the boy in children's clothes, posed him as if sleeping, and photographed him, hoping the familiar image might jog someone's memory. They printed more than 10,000 flyers with his picture, distributing them across Philadelphia, across Pennsylvania, and as far as New Jersey. They checked orphanages, foster homes, hospitals, and schools. They followed every lead, knocked on doors, asked neighbors if they had ever seen the boy, and still, no one recognized him. The city grew invested. Newspapers printed his photograph again and again, sometimes showing his face, sometimes the box, sometimes the blanket. Reporters called him the boy in the box. The name stuck. The public followed the case with growing unease. How could a child be so alone in the world that no one even knew his name? In July of 1957, when no identification could be found, the boy was buried in a potter's field in Philadelphia. His small grave marker bore no name, only the words, "Heavenly Father, bless this unknown boy." Strangers wept for him. Police officers who had worked the case for months carried the coffin themselves. The community grieved as though he were their own, but detectives never let go. Over the years, theories grew. One woman known as M came forward decades later, claiming her abusive mother had purchased the boy from his birth family and kept him locked in their home, subjecting him to years of cruelty before finally killing him. Her account was detailed and disturbing, but investigators could never prove it. Other theories suggested he had been raised in a foster home where abuse was rampant, or that he had been trafficked and discarded when no longer useful. Every decade, new leads appeared. Psychics claimed to know who he was. Retired detectives pursued hunches. Volunteers tended his grave, bringing fresh flowers, refusing to let him be forgotten. In 1998, his body was exhumed so that DNA samples could be taken. The DNA was preserved, though databases at the time held no match. He was reburied with ceremony, and his gravestone was updated to read, "America's Unknown Child." For years he remained a mystery. His image, solemn, bruised, small, became one of the most haunting unsolved crime photos in America. Generations of Philadelphians knew his story. Parents told their children about him as a warning, and detectives carried his file long after they retired. Finally, in 2022, technology caught up with the mystery. Advances in forensic genealogy, the same methods that had solved the Golden State Killer case, were applied to his DNA. Step by step, distant relatives were traced, family trees mapped, connections narrowed. After 65 years, the boy in the box had a name. He was identified as Joseph Augustus Zarelli, born in Philadelphia in 1953. He had been just 4 years old at the time of his death. The revelation made national news. Crowds gathered as his name was finally added to his headstone. Investigators stood solemnly, reading his name aloud for the first time. Joseph had been lost for decades, but now he was remembered as a son, a brother, a child who had belonged to someone. But even with his name, the mystery is not solved. Who killed Joseph? Why was he discarded in a box, abandoned on a cold February day? His parents were identified, but many questions remain about what they knew, what role they played, and who else may have been involved. Detectives continue to pursue leads, hoping that one day the same science that restored his name will also reveal his killer. Joseph's story is tragic, but it is also a testament to persistence. For 65 years, police, journalists, and ordinary citizens refused to let him be forgotten. They kept his photograph alive, tended his grave, and pushed for answers. In the end, they succeeded in giving him back his name. Tonight, his story reminds us how fragile life can be, and how even the smallest among us deserve justice and remembrance. Joseph Augustus Zarelli, once the boy in the box, will never again be forgotten. Story 2. The Tylenol Murders, 1982, Chicago, USA. It was late September of 1982 in the Chicago area. The air had begun to cool with autumn, and leaves drifted from trees into quiet suburban streets. Families shopped for school supplies, picked up groceries, and bought small bottles of Tylenol, the popular pain reliever found in nearly every American home. It was ordinary, routine, something no one thought twice about until suddenly it became deadly. On the morning of September 29th, 12-year-old Mary Kellerman of Elk Grove Village woke up feeling sick. She had a runny nose and a sore throat, the kind of thing children catch in the early weeks of school. Her parents gave her a single extra-strength Tylenol capsule. Minutes later, she collapsed. By the time she reached the hospital, she was gone. Doctors were baffled. How could a healthy child die so suddenly? That same day, in another suburb not far away, a man named Adam Janus left work early, complaining of chest pain. He went home, took Tylenol, and collapsed. He was rushed to the hospital and pronounced dead. Family members gathered at his house to grieve. In their sorrow, his brother Stanley and Stanley's wife, Teresa, both took Tylenol from the same bottle. Within hours, they too were dead. 3 members of the same family, gone in a single day. Soon after, 3 more deaths occurred. Mary Reiner, who had recently given birth and took Tylenol for pain. Paula Prince, a flight attendant who bought Tylenol from a Chicago drugstore. And Mary McFarland, a young office worker. In each case, the story was the same: an ordinary capsule swallowed, followed by sudden collapse and death. By the time investigators connected the dots, 7 people in the Chicago area were dead. The cause was traced to cyanide, a fast-acting poison. Someone had taken bottles of extra-strength Tylenol capsules, opened them, replaced some of the medicine with cyanide powder, and returned them to store shelves. The capsules looked normal, but inside they were death. The discovery sent shockwaves across the country. Tylenol was one of the most trusted household medicines, found in every cabinet. Suddenly, the safety of something so ordinary was in question. Panic spread. News reports warned viewers to throw away their Tylenol. Hospitals set up hotlines. Police cars drove through neighborhoods with loudspeakers, telling people not to take the medicine. Store shelves were emptied overnight, bottles tossed into trash cans. The manufacturer, Johnson & Johnson, faced a crisis unlike any in corporate history, but rather than deny responsibility, the company took bold action. They issued a nationwide recall of all Tylenol products, 31 million bottles pulled from shelves. They offered exchanges, refunds, and reassurance. Executives went on television urging people not to take their product until it was safe again. The swift, transparent response is often credited with saving the company's reputation and is still studied in business schools today. But the question remained, who had done this? Investigators believed the poisonings had not occurred at the factory, but at the retail level. The bottles had been tampered with after reaching stores, suggesting someone had taken them off shelves laced the capsules, and then quietly returned them. Detectives combed through surveillance footage, receipts, and store records, but in 1982, cameras were rare, and tracking purchases was nearly impossible. One man quickly drew attention: James William Lewis. He had written a letter to Johnson, and Johnson demanding $1 million to stop the killings. The letter claimed responsibility, but when police investigated, they discovered Lewis lived in New York at the time of the murders and could not have tampered with bottles in Chicago. He was convicted of extortion and served time in prison, but never charged with murder. He died in 2023, still denying he had killed anyone. Other suspects emerged. Some thought it was a disgruntled employee, though no evidence supported that theory. Others wondered if it was a random act of domestic terrorism. The FBI pursued leads for years, but no one was ever charged. The case grew colder as the years passed. The impact, however, was immediate and permanent. In the aftermath, the U.S. government passed laws requiring tamper-evident packaging on medicines and foods. Those foil seals and plastic wrappers we see today, the ones that pop or crack when opened, were direct results of the Tylenol murders. Capsule medicines were redesigned to make them harder to alter. Companies changed their supply chains, monitoring products more closely. A crime that killed 7 people changed how millions of people around the world bought and consumed medicine. For the families, though, the changes were small comfort. Parents mourned their children, spouses buried their partners, siblings grieved in shock. The randomness of the crime made it unbearable. Anyone could have picked up one of those bottles. It could have been anyone's family, destroyed in an instant. To this day, the Tylenol murders remain unsolved. Investigators revisited the case in the early 2000s with new DNA techniques, retesting evidence, examining packaging, and re-interviewing suspects. They continued to circle around James Lewis, but without hard proof, the case remained open. Each year, anniversaries bring renewed media attention, and each year the same painful questions resurface. Why did someone do it? Was it revenge, thrill-seeking, extortion gone wrong? Or was it something darker, a person who found satisfaction in watching panic spread? We may never know. The Tylenol murders are remembered not only for the horror of the crime, but for the way it shook the public's trust. Before 1982, few people thought twice about tampering. After 1982, every bottle, every box, every seal carried with it the unspoken memory of what had happened in Chicago. 7 people died, their lives cut short by a faceless killer, but their deaths reshaped an industry, changed consumer protection forever, and left behind a mystery that still lingers. Somewhere out there, the person who laced those bottles with cyanide may have watched the panic unfold and may have carried the secret to their grave. Story 3. The Hinterkaifeck Farm Murders, 1922 Germany. The world of 1922 Bavaria was still scarred by war. The First World War had ended only a few years earlier, leaving Germany broken and weary. Inflation gripped the nation, food was scarce, and families worked long hours just to survive. In the countryside, life was hard, but steady. Small villages dotted the rolling hills, surrounded by farmland and forests. The seasons governed everything: planting, harvesting, the rhythm of church bells, the markets in town. Hinterkaifeck was one of these farms, a modest property about an hour north of Munich, outside the small town of Grobern. The farm sat apart from neighbors, surrounded by fields and thick woods. A narrow track led up to the farmhouse, which was built of timber and stone, its roof pitched against the snow. Inside it was practical and plain, wooden floors, a kitchen with a heavy iron stove, narrow staircases, and an attic above the bedrooms. Attached was a barn for cattle and horses, with hay stacked high and tools leaned against the walls. From the outside it looked like any other Bavarian farm, but inside the Gruber household, life was not as ordinary as it seemed. The head of the family was Andreas Gruber, 63 years old. Neighbors described him as difficult, quick-tempered, and harsh. His wife, 72-year-old Cecilia, was quieter, long-suffering, often bending under her husband's will. Their widowed daughter Victoria lived with them, a 35-year-old woman raising 2 children of her own, little Cecilia, just 7 years old, and Joseph, a toddler of only 2. Completing the household, at least on the day of the murders, was the new maid, Maria Baumgartner. She arrived on March 31st, 1922, her first day on the job and her last day alive. The Gruber family carried a reputation in the village that was not kind. Andreas was disliked, sometimes feared. Rumors circulated about the family's secrets, and the most scandalous was the alleged relationship between Andreas and his daughter Victoria. In fact, both had once been convicted of incest in court, though they denied the charge later. Victoria longed for freedom. She had pursued a relationship with a neighbor, a widower named Lorenz Schlittenbauer, and hoped to remarry, but her father forbade it. Some whispered that her young son Joseph might even have been Schlittenbauer's child, though Andreas insisted the boy was his. The scandal made the family the subject of gossip and judgment in Gruber. In the days before the murders, strange events unsettled the farm. Andreas confided to neighbors that he had discovered footprints in the snow leading from the forest to the farmhouse. Oddly, there were no tracks leading back. Inside the house, he heard footsteps in the attic, heavy enough to make the boards creak. Tools disappeared without explanation. A newspaper from Munich was found in the house, though no one in the family subscribed to it or had traveled to get one. And then there were the missing keys, gone from their usual place with no sign of theft. Andreas spoke of these events uneasily, but in those days, people shrugged such things off. Farms were lonely places. Strange noises were explained away by the wind, or animals, or imagination. Still, a sense of dread hung over Hinterkaifeck in those last days of March. On the evening of March 31st, the household settled in. The new maid Maria unpacked her things. Victoria tucked her children into bed. The lamps were turned low. Perhaps the family tried to ignore the sounds they had heard, the shadows they felt. At some point that evening, one by one, members of the family went out to the barn. Maybe they heard the cattle stirring. Maybe they thought someone was outside. Andreas went first. In the dark of the barn, among the hay and the smell of animals, he was struck with a mattock, a heavy farming tool with a blade on one side and a blunt end on the other. The blow crushed his skull. Then came Cecilia, his wife, who followed, perhaps to see what was wrong. She too was struck down. Victoria was next, and finally the little girl, 7-year-old Cecilia. Each one lured, each one killed with the same savage force. In the house, the maid Maria was murdered in her bed before she had even grown accustomed to her new surroundings. And finally the toddler, Joseph, asleep in his crib, was silenced. 6 people in total. Their lives ended in a single night. What makes the Hinterkaifeck murders so disturbing is not only the brutality, but what happened afterward. The killer did not flee. He stayed for the next several days. Smoke rose from the farmhouse chimney. Neighbors noticed it and assumed the family was going about its work. The cows were milked, the chickens fed, meals prepared, bread baked. Someone lived at Hinterkaifeck even as the family lay dead in barn and house. Whoever killed them was comfortable enough to tend the farm as if it were his own. The murders were not discovered until April 4th, when neighbors finally grew concerned. The children had not come to school. Victoria had not been seen at church. The family seemed to have vanished. Several villagers, including Lorenz Schlittenbauer, made their way to the farm. They entered the barn first, and what they saw silenced them. There, under piles of hay, lay the bodies of Andreas, his wife, Victoria, and little Cecilia. Inside the house, they found the maid Maria and the toddler Joseph. Word spread quickly through the village. Crowds gathered outside the farm, horrified and curious. In those days, crime scenes were not protected as they are now. Villagers wandered in and out of the house, trampling evidence, moving objects, staring in shock at the carnage. By the time investigators from Munich arrived, the crime scene had been hopelessly contaminated. Autopsies revealed the full horror. Andreas had suffered multiple blows to the head, his face unrecognizable. Victoria's skull was smashed, and little Cecilia had clumps of her own hair torn out, evidence that she had lived for hours after the attack, pulling at herself in pain and terror. The maid Maria had been killed in her bed, likely with little struggle. Joseph, the toddler, had been struck as he slept. The weapon was believed to be a mattock, but it was never found. Investigators searched for suspects, but suspicion spread in all directions. Neighbors whispered that Lorenz Schlittenbauer had motive, rejected by Victoria, angry about rumors that Joseph might be his son. Some noted his strange behavior upon discovering the bodies, how calmly he moved through the farm, even opening doors and handling objects without hesitation. Others insisted he was simply helping. No evidence tied him to the killings. Other theories abounded. Perhaps a vagrant had wandered in from the forest, hiding in the attic as Andreas had suspected, and struck when the time was right. Perhaps it was revenge from one of Andreas's many enemies. Others speculated it was robbery, though money and valuables were left untouched. Over the years, more than 100 suspects were questioned, but each theory unraveled. Even decades later, when the case was reopened and modern forensic methods applied to preserved skulls, no clear answers emerged. The farmhouse itself stood for years, avoided by locals. Some claimed to hear voices in the barn at night, or footsteps in the attic. Children dared each other to approach, then ran screaming from the silence. Eventually, the house was torn down, and today only a small shrine marks the site. Visitors still come, leaving flowers, whispering prayers, wondering who walked across the snowy fields in 1922 and destroyed a family. The Hinterkaifeck murders remain one of Germany's most haunting unsolved crimes. The image of smoke rising from the chimney while the family lay dead, of cattle lowing in the barn while their keepers were gone, of neighbors passing by unaware that horror lingered behind those wooden walls. It all remains chilling to this day. Some mysteries fade with time, But this one endures, who killed the Grubers, who stayed in their home, living among their corpses. Why did he vanish into the night, leaving behind only silence and questions? We may never know. Story 4. The Cleveland Torso Murders. The 1930s were a time of struggle. The crash of 1929 had plunged America into economic despair, and Cleveland was no exception. Along the shores of Lake Erie and in the shadow of steel mills, thousands were out of work. Families lost homes, and men drifted from job to job. Shanty towns sprang up in valleys, riverbeds, and under bridges, places built from scrap wood, cardboard, and tin. One such area was Kingsbury Run, a low, marshy valley cut through by rail lines on the east side of the city. It was a place where transients and the homeless sought shelter, where fires burned in barrels and ragged men warmed their hands against the cold. Life was hard, dirty, and desperate. It was here, amid this backdrop, that the first body appeared. In September 1934, along the shores of Lake Erie, a young man's remains were found. His torso was mutilated, his head missing. At first, police treated it as an isolated case, a crime of passion, perhaps, or a gang killing. But the following year, in September 1935, two boys playing in Kingsbury Run stumbled upon something that would set Cleveland on edge. They found the remains of two men, both decapitated, both mutilated in ways too gruesome to describe in detail. The killings bore the mark of precision. Whoever had done this was not only brutal, but deliberate. The discovery was just the beginning. Over the next few years, bodies continued to appear. Some were hidden in bushes, others in open lots, still others dumped brazenly, where they would quickly be found. By 1938, at least 12 victims had been discovered, though some investigators believed the true number was closer to 20. Many victims were never identified. They were the forgotten ones of society. Drifters, the homeless, sex workers, people without families to claim them. Their anonymity made the killer's work all the more chilling. The press pounced on the story. Headlines screamed of the torso murderer and the mad butcher of Kingsbury Run. Reporters lingered in the valley, describing in lurid detail the shantytown hovels, the acrid smoke from cooking fires, the sense that anyone could vanish into the shadows and be found later in pieces. Ordinary Clevelanders were horrified. Families locked their doors. Men warned wives and children not to linger after dark. The idea that a killer was roaming freely, decapitating victims and leaving bodies in plain sight, spread fear like wildfire. Police struggled. The coroner's office worked tirelessly to examine the remains, but forensic science in the 1930s was limited. They cataloged scars, tattoos, even fingerprints when they could, and sometimes managed to identify victims. One was Florence Polillo, a barmaid and occasional sex worker who lived on the margins of society. Another was a man known only as the Tattooed Man, recognized solely because of the colorful designs inked across his body. Others were never named. They were reduced to case numbers, their identities as lost as their lives. The killer's method showed a pattern. Victims were often beheaded, sometimes while still alive. Some bodies were cut into halves or thirds. In certain cases, chemical preservatives seemed to have been applied to the skin, as though the killer had an interest in experimentation. The brutality suggested sadism, but also a kind of ritual. Whoever the killer was, he was not killing for money. He was killing for reasons darker and more personal. The city's leaders were desperate for answers, and in 1935, Cleveland had a man with a legendary reputation in charge of public safety, Elliot Ness. Ness was famous for leading the Untouchables in Chicago and helping to bring down Al Capone. By the mid-1930s, he had been hired as Cleveland's safety director, responsible for the police and fire departments. To the public, he was incorruptible, brilliant, and fearless. Surely people thought if anyone could stop the Mad Butcher, it would be Ness. But even Ness struggled. Police rounded up suspects by the dozens. They scoured Kingsbury Run, raided flop houses, interrogated known criminals. Detectives followed rumors that the killer might be a butcher, a medical student, or even a doctor with surgical knowledge. One name stood out: Dr. Francis E. Sweeney, a physician with a troubled past. He had served in World War I, treating battlefield injuries, and returned a broken man, prone to alcohol and violence. Ness himself oversaw an interrogation of Sweeney, reportedly subjecting him to days of questioning. Sweeney eventually cracked, confessing to nothing but babbling incoherently, his mind clearly unstable. Ness had him committed to a mental institution, but no charges were ever filed. Sweeney would later send Ness mocking postcards from the hospital, taunting him for his failure. Many investigators believed then, and still believe now, that Sweeney was the torso killer. Others were not so sure. The murders bore similarities to killings in other cities, including Pittsburgh and Youngstown. Was the butcher a transient, riding the rails and leaving a trail of bodies wherever he went? Or was he rooted in Cleveland, moving unseen through the city he knew so well? Each theory raised new questions, and no theory could be proven. By 1938, with bodies continuing to appear, Ness made a controversial decision. He ordered a massive raid on Kingsbury Run. Police swept through the valley, arresting transients and dismantling shacks. Then, in an action that horrified many, Ness ordered the shanty town burned to the ground. Fires consumed the ramshackle huts, sending smoke billowing into the sky. Homeless men and women scattered, their meager possessions lost. Ness hoped the action would flush the killer out, or at least destroy his hunting ground. But the raid drew heavy criticism. It seemed less like justice and more like punishing the poor, and Ness's reputation suffered. After 1938, the murders slowed and eventually stopped. Some saw this as proof that the raid had succeeded, that the butcher had been driven away. Others believed the killer simply changed hunting grounds. Either way, Cleveland never saw another series of murders quite like those years in Kingsbury Run. The case, however, was never solved. Files remained open for decades. Detectives retired, with the case still gnawing at them. The victims, many of them unidentified, were buried quietly, their graves marked with little more than numbers. The torso killer had taken their lives and stolen even their names. Today, the case is remembered as one of America's most terrifying unsolved serial killings. The name Elliot Ness is often tied to it, though it was the one case he could not crack. Theories abound. Some historians are convinced Dr. Sweeney was the killer. Others argue the butcher was never caught, that he continued to kill in other cities. A few even suggest there was more than one murderer, a possibility raised by the different methods found in the bodies. What lingers is the image of Cleveland in the 1930s, smoke hanging over factories, trains clattering through the valley, the shantytown fires burning against the night. In that setting, a shadowy figure moved among the poorest, taking lives at will, leaving only mutilated remains. He was never caught, never named, and never punished. The Cleveland Torso murders remind us of how society often fails its most vulnerable. The homeless and forgotten became prey because they were invisible, because their lives were not protected by wealth or status. The butcher chose them for that reason, knowing they could vanish without consequence. His crimes left scars on a city already suffering, and his identity became a ghost story that still haunts Cleveland's history. Story 5. Mary Bell, the 11-year-old killer. I'll tell you a story that unsettles even seasoned true crime historians. It is the story of a child who killed a girl of only 11 years old, whose crime shocked England in the summer of 1968. Her name was Mary Bell, and she remains one of the youngest convicted killers in British history. To understand Mary's story, we need to begin not with the crimes, but with her childhood, because her early years were marked by neglect, abuse, and trauma that many experts believe shaped what came after. Mary Flora Bell was born on May 26, 1957, in Newcastle upon Tyne, in northern England. She grew up in Scotswood, a working-class neighborhood of tight brick houses and narrow streets. It was a place marked by poverty, unemployment, and the scars of post-war rebuilding. Families scraped by on factory wages or odd jobs. Children played in the streets, often unsupervised, darting between traffic and derelict buildings. It was not an easy place to grow up, and for Mary, it was far harsher than most. Story 6. The Black Dahlia Murder, 1947, Los Angeles, USA. I'll tell you a story that has haunted Los Angeles for more than 75 years. A story of glamour and poverty, of dreams and nightmares. A story about a young woman who wanted a better life and ended up as the centerpiece of one of America's most infamous unsolved murders. Her name was Elizabeth Short, but the world came to know her by another name, the Black Dahlia. To understand her story, we need to step back into Los Angeles in the 1940s. The Second World War had just ended, and the city was booming. Hollywood was the dream factory of the world. Soldiers returned home with hopes of finding work, and young women poured into Los Angeles, chasing movie stardom. The streets of Hollywood and downtown LA buzzed with neon lights, nightclubs, and smoke-filled bars. Beneath the glamour, however, lay a harsher reality. Not everyone who came found fame. Many struggled in boarding houses, took jobs as waitresses or shop clerks, and lived on the edge of poverty. Elizabeth Short was one of them. Elizabeth was born in 1924 in Boston, Massachusetts, the third of 5 daughters. Her childhood was marked by hardship. Her father abandoned the family when she was young, leaving her mother to raise 5 girls alone during the Great Depression. Elizabeth was known for her beauty, pale skin, dark hair, striking blue eyes, and from an early age, she longed for something beyond her small-town life. As a teenager, she lived for a time in Florida, then drifted west. By her 20s, she had found her way to California, chasing the dream of Hollywood. She lived a transient life. Friends and acquaintances described her as charming, polite, and glamorous. Though she had little money, she often relied on acquaintances and boyfriends for a place to stay. She was known for her style. She favored sheer blouses, tailored skirts, and red lipstick, cultivating a look of mystery. Some said she was nicknamed the Black Dahlia by men at a drugstore in Long Beach, a play on the popular film The Blue Dahlia and her habit of wearing dark clothes. But behind the image, Elizabeth was struggling. She had no steady job, no secure home, and was often broke. She dreamed of becoming an actress, but there is no record of her ever landing a role. She moved from city to city, sometimes Los Angeles, sometimes San Diego, always living on the edge, chasing opportunity, hoping for a breakthrough. On January 15th, 1947, Elizabeth Short's life ended in a way that shocked the nation. That morning, in the Lamert Park neighborhood of Los Angeles, a woman walking with her daughter noticed what she thought was a mannequin lying in a vacant lot. As they approached, they realized it was not a mannequin at all. It was the body of a young woman, naked, severed in two at the waist. The skin was pale, the lips slashed into a grotesque smile. It was Elizabeth Short. The crime scene horrified even hardened police. Elizabeth's body had been drained of blood, her skin scrubbed clean, as though the killer had tried to erase evidence. She had been mutilated in ways too disturbing to describe fully. The sheer brutality suggested not just murder, but obsession. News of the murder spread instantly. The press swarmed the story, sensationalizing every detail. Elizabeth was painted alternately as a starlet, a temptress, and a tragic figure. Newspapers dug into her past, interviewing friends, printing rumors, twisting her life into a lurid tale. The name Black Dahlia became a headline that sold thousands of papers. Police launched a massive investigation. They interviewed more than 150 suspects, followed hundreds of leads, and combed through Elizabeth's last known movements. Witnesses claimed to have seen her in various nightclubs in the days before her death, sometimes alone, sometimes with men, but her trail was confusing, filled with contradictions. Letters began arriving at the police station, and newspapers, some signed by a supposed killer. One package contained Elizabeth's birth certificate, social security card, photographs, and an address book, items believed to be hers. The envelope had been cleaned with gasoline, as though the sender wanted to remove fingerprints. Some letters mocked the police, daring them to catch the killer. Whether these were truly from the murderer or just cruel hoaxes has never been proven. The investigation sprawled. At one point, the Los Angeles Police Department had over 50 detectives assigned to the case. Suspects included doctors, actors, servicemen, and drifters. One doctor, George Hodel, has in later years been heavily suspected thanks to his son's claims and circumstantial evidence. Hodel was a wealthy, brilliant but disturbing figure, rumored to have dark tendencies and connections in Hollywood. He lived near where Elizabeth's body was found, but in 1947, the case against him was never solid, and he was never charged. Other suspects were questioned and released. Each lead seemed promising, but each unraveled. Witnesses contradicted each other. Evidence was contaminated. Forensic science in the 1940s was limited, and many opportunities to preserve clues were lost. Meanwhile, the public devoured the story. The Black Dahlia became not just a murder victim, but a symbol. Hollywood fed the legend, with films and novels inspired by her death. Some portrayed her as a tragic starlet destroyed by the dark side of fame. Others as a femme fatale whose dangerous allure led her to ruin. The truth was simpler and sadder. She was a young woman adrift, alone in a big city, whose life was cut short in unimaginable violence. The case eventually went cold, Detectives retired, still haunted by the files on their desks. Over the decades, new theories emerged. Some linked the murder to other unsolved killings in Los Angeles, suggesting a serial killer. Others insisted it was the work of one of the many men Elizabeth had known. Some believed it was Dr. George Hodel, whose name has gained traction in modern times, especially after his son, a former LAPD detective, wrote a book accusing him. Still, no conclusive evidence has ever surfaced. Today, more than 75 years later, the murder of Elizabeth Short remains officially unsolved. Her name lives on in books, films, and endless speculation. Tourists still visit Leimert Park, where a vacant lot once held her body. Her story has become part of Los Angeles folklore, woven into the city's dark history of unsolved crimes and shattered dreams. The Black Dahlia case forces us to confront not only the cruelty of her killer, but also the way society consumed her story. Elizabeth was turned into a headline, a nickname, a myth, rather than remembered simply as a young woman who lost her life. She deserved more, and yet she became immortal in a way she never could have imagined. Her mother, Betty, was only 17 when Mary was born. Betty worked as a prostitute, leaving Mary with relatives or neighbors for long stretches of time. There are reports that Betty resented Mary's existence, that she tried more than once to harm her even as an infant. Some relatives later claimed Betty attempted to feed her sleeping pills, that she once even dropped the baby from a window. Whether these stories are exaggerated or not, what is clear is that Mary's childhood was unstable, frightening, and filled with danger. Her father figure was absent. The man she believed was her father drifted in and out of prison for petty crimes. Mary grew up surrounded by violence. By the age of 5, she was said to be cold and withdrawn, yet also manipulative. Neighbors noticed she sometimes lashed out at other children, squeezing their throats, pressing hands over their mouths, calling it a game. Warnings were raised, but in those days, children's cruelty was often brushed aside as mischief. By 1968, Mary was 11 years old. She was small for her age, with dark hair and sharp features. Those who knew her described her as strange, sometimes sweet, other times unsettling. She had a friend, a 13-year-old girl named Norma Bell. Despite sharing a last name, they were not related. Norma was slower, more impressionable, and Mary seemed to dominate her. Together, the two girls roamed the streets of Scottswood, restless and unsupervised. On May 25, 1968, the day before Mary's 11th birthday, tragedy struck. A 4-year-old boy named Martin Brown was found dead in a derelict house in Scottswood. The house was an empty shell, abandoned and half collapsed, a place children sometimes played. Martin's body was discovered by 3 other kids who had wandered inside. At first, police thought it was an accident. There were no clear wounds, just a small amount of blood and saliva. Some thought he had swallowed pills or fallen. The death was treated as suspicious, but not immediately ruled a murder. But something was strange. Around the neighborhood, Mary and Norma behaved oddly. They told classmates they had seen Martin's body before police arrived, though this wasn't true. They laughed inappropriately when the boy's death was mentioned. Days later, when Martin's family gathered to mourn, Mary appeared at their door and asked to see him. When his mother explained he was dead, Mary calmly replied, "I know he's dead. I want to see him in his coffin." The comment chilled Martin's grieving family. 2 months later, on July 31st, 1968, another child vanished. 3-year-old Brian Howe was last seen playing outside with other children. His family grew concerned when he did not return home. Searchers combed the neighborhood. Eventually, his body was found in a wasteland area, hidden among rubble and grass. This time, the truth was undeniable. Brian had been strangled. His body bore small puncture marks, and someone had used scissors to cut into his hair and skin. Chillingly, the letter M was scratched onto his stomach with a razor blade or knife. The murder horrified Newcastle. The idea that someone was preying on children was terrifying. Police swarmed the area, questioning neighbors. Witnesses reported seeing Mary and Norma with Brian shortly before he disappeared. Their behavior had raised suspicions before, and now detectives looked closely at the two girls. When interrogated, Norma wept and insisted Mary was the leader. Mary, by contrast, was calm, even defiant. She changed her story repeatedly, offering details only the killer could know. At one point, she described the scissors used on Brian's body before police had revealed that fact. The evidence mounted. Eventually, both girls were arrested and charged with murder. The trial began in December 1968 at Newcastle Assizes. It was a spectacle. 2 young girls, one barely a teenager, standing accused of killing children. The courtroom was packed with reporters, families, and officials. Mary sat in the dock, small and composed, sometimes smirking, sometimes cold. Norma appeared overwhelmed, tearful, confused. The prosecution painted Mary as manipulative, intelligent, and chillingly devoid of empathy. They argued that she had dominated Norma and planned the killings, motivated not by anger or accident, but by a dark fascination with death. The defense argued that Mary herself was a victim of a brutal childhood, that she lacked the capacity to understand the consequences of her actions. Psychiatrists described her as exhibiting psychopathic traits. In the end, the jury acquitted Norma, believing she had been led astray by Mary, but Mary was convicted of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. She was only 11 years old, yet she was sentenced to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, an indefinite sentence allowing her to be held as long as authorities deemed necessary. Mary served her time in various institutions, moving from juvenile centers to adult prisons. As she grew older, reports suggest she was difficult, manipulative, but also intelligent. She eventually became a mother herself while still young, her child briefly placed in care. In 1980, at the age of 23, Mary Bell was released from prison after serving 12 years. She was granted a new identity and given anonymity to protect her and her daughter from public backlash. The debate about Mary Bell has never ended. Was she a born killer, a child with an innate darkness, or was she the product of abuse, neglect, and trauma that twisted her before she had a chance to grow? Psychologists continue to study her case, using it as an example of how early violence and neglect can shape a child's development. The families of Martin Brown and Brian Howe never fully recovered. To lose a child is unbearable. To learn that the killer was herself, a child, was beyond comprehension. For the people of Newcastle, the summer of 1968 remains a scar, a time when the innocence of childhood was shattered. Today, Mary Bell lives in anonymity somewhere in the United Kingdom. She is protected by law, her new identity shielded, her daughter's identity hidden as well. few know who she is or where she resides, but her story still circulates in books, documentaries, and classrooms, a grim reminder of what can happen when a child's early life is filled with neglect and cruelty. Mary Bell's case remains unique. She was not a victim of a momentary accident or rage. She killed twice, deliberately at an age when most children are still learning arithmetic and playing games. Her story forces us to confront unsettling questions. How much of violence is born within us, and how much is shaped by the world around us? How young can darkness take root, and can it ever be undone? Story 6. The Axemen of New Orleans. Took you back to New Orleans in 1918, a city of music, mystery, and fear. For over a year, the people of New Orleans lived under the shadow of a killer who crept into homes at night, wielding an axe. He left families slaughtered in their beds, then vanished back into the dark. The newspapers called him the Axeman. His crimes were brutal, his identity unknown, and his legend lives on to this day. To understand the fear the Axeman inspired, you have to picture New Orleans at the time. It was the end of the First World War. The city was alive with jazz, the new music born in its clubs and streets. Streetcars clattered down Canal Street. Vendors sold oysters and chicory coffee in the French Market, and neighborhoods bustled with immigrants, Italians, Sicilians, Germans, Irish, all trying to make their way in America. New Orleans was vibrant, but it was also divided. Poverty pressed against wealth, and crime simmered in the streets. On May 23, 1918, the terror began. In the city's 7th Ward, grocer Joseph Maggio and his wife Catherine were attacked as they slept in their small apartment above their store. The killer had chiseled open a panel in the back door, entered silently, and struck them with their own axe. Catherine's throat was slit. Joseph lingered in agony for hours before dying. Neighbors discovered the scene. Blood splashed across the walls, the axe abandoned outside. The brutality stunned police. And first it seemed like an isolated crime. But weeks later, on June 27th, another attack occurred. Louis Bessumer, another grocer, and his mistress, Harriet Lowe, were struck as they slept in their apartment behind the store. Both were found with skull fractures, the axe left behind. Harriet lingered in the hospital, slipping in and out of consciousness. She accused Bessumer of being a German spy, fueling wartime paranoia, but later died of her injuries. By now, the pattern was forming. The killer struck at night. He entered homes by removing panels from doors with a chisel. He used axes or straight razors, often taken from the victim's own homes. He attacked sleeping couples, usually grocers of Italian or Sicilian descent, and he left weapons behind as if unconcerned with covering his tracks. Fear gripped the city. People armed themselves, sitting up at night with shotguns. Doors and shutters were bolted tight. But the killer was not done. On August 5th, Mrs. Schneider, a young woman 8 months pregnant, was attacked in her bed. She survived, and so did her child, but the brutality shocked the city further. In March of 1919, the Axeman struck again, killing grocer Charles Cordemilia's wife and daughter in Gretna, across the river from New Orleans. Charles survived, but in his grief, he accused neighbors of the crime, leading to wrongful convictions. The case revealed how desperate the city was for answers, how willing authorities were to pin the crimes on anyone in order to calm the public. The most chilling moment of the Axeman saga came not from his crimes, but from a letter. On March 13th, 1919, the New Orleans Times-Picayune received a message signed by the Axeman, written in florid mocking prose. It claimed he was a demon from hell, invisible and unstoppable. The letter promised that on the night of March 19th he would strike again, but he would spare any household where a jazz band was playing. That night, New Orleans erupted in music. Jazz poured from homes, bars, and dance halls. Families hired bands to play in their living rooms. Phonographs blared records into the streets. The city turned into one great concert, defying the killer with sound. True to his word, the Axeman killed no one that night. But the murders continued later. In August 1919, grocer Steve Baca and his wife were attacked. They survived, but could give no clear description of the killer. In October, Mike Pepitone was killed in his bed, his head smashed with an axe. His wife awoke to find blood everywhere, the walls splattered, her husband dying beside her. It was the Axeman's last known crime. And then, just as suddenly as he appeared, he vanished. The police never solved the case. Dozens of suspects were questioned. Some thought the killer was a local man with a grudge against Italian grocers. Others believed he was a drifter who rode the trains, killing in one city and then moving on. Theories tied him to earlier axe murders in Texas, suggesting he may have been a traveling serial killer, but no one was ever arrested and no one was ever proven guilty. The legend of the Axeman grew. The letter about jazz gave the case an almost supernatural edge, tying it forever to the music of New Orleans. Some saw him as a demon, others as a madman. In time, he became folklore, a boogeyman figure, invoked in tales told to frighten children. Historians now look back at the case with fascination. The brutality of the crimes, the racial and social tensions of the city, the sensational press coverage, all combined to make the Axeman unforgettable. He remains a reminder of how fear can grip a city, how violence can slip through locked doors, and how some mysteries endure for generations. Tonight, as you lie awake, picture New Orleans in 1919. The sound of jazz drifting through the humid night air, families huddled in their homes, some dancing in defiance, others praying for safety, and somewhere, in the shadows, a figure with an axe, watching, waiting, and then vanishing into history. Thank you for staying with me tonight for this story. If you're still awake, let me know where you're listening from, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss the next case. For now, good night, and stay safe.